Parashat Yitro, amazing Parsha. Um, and uh, Dr. Zornberg starts us off with uh, a lot, including, I think, an interesting insight into the relationship between the story of Yitro, which opens the Parashah, and the experience of the revelation. And mostly, she'll focus on what we could learn through the story of Yitro, her much more extended reflections on the experience of revelation occupies the rest of the chapter. So this somewhat stands on its own. And if you have the book and you want to read on, I think it provides a great sort of opener to what is to come. I'll share my screen so we can begin. Yitro, and the trauma of revelation, a paradigm. I think it's interesting just to, I'll say it this way, it's at least much more straightforward from the text that revelation is a scary experience in a variety of ways for Bnei Israel. So there's no need for recourse to midrashim or anything else. But it's sort of interesting in light of last week, where Bishalach, she took an experience which we might typically think of as joyful and added the dimensions of fear and uncertainty into it. And now in an experience which, again, we know much more straightforwardly had fear in it. Still, again, she's entering into that side of things primarily. Again, it's much more straightforward in the text in this case, but just the juxtaposition of the two stands out. And of course, also she will lift up the other side of the revelation experience a little bit. Yitro joins the Israelites, a new structure of identity. The experience of revelation is attended by conflicting emotions. For the people standing at Sinai at the highest point of their national history, fear vies with love, repulsion with attraction. In the biblical text, they recoil, yield place to Moses. In the Midrashic narratives, the tension of desire and terror becomes central and overwhelming. The nature of this tension is the subject of our exploration. Why do the people recoil, resign their prophetic role to Moses? And how is one to relate to such a retreat? Now, this is, as I understand it, this is sort of the framing question for the whole chapter. And actually, I think we won't see too much in terms of the answer to that question in this opening section. In a characteristic juxtaposition of narratives from different registers of experience, the Torah prefaces the terror and glory of the giving of the Torah with the story of a family reunion. Now, before she goes on, I just want to say, I didn't give the time to think about other examples of this, but I'll leave that, point that out and invite us to think about that. If this is a characteristic juxtaposition of narratives from different registers of experience, what can we think about in terms of other instances in the Torah where there is a juxtaposition of narratives from different registers of experience? So again, feel free, if you think of any, to suggest them along the way. Maybe as we see how she describes this one, we'll get a better sense of it, what this phenomenon is that she's describing. She doesn't footnote it and list other instances, but she just starts off with this assertion that something the Torah does is put alongside each other stories, again, whatever this means, from different registers of experience. The Torah prefaces the terror and glory of the giving of the Torah with the story of a family reunion. I guess minimally, I don't know if we can understand the different registers of experience being the smaller familial with the greater national, or the register of kind of emotional positivity with something that's more emotionally fraught and complex. Either way. Moshe's father-in-law, Jethro, arrives in the Israelite camp, bringing Moshe's wife and 2 sons. Chapter 18 tells in a matter-of-fact way of this family reunion, of a meal shared with Aaron and the elders, and of Yitro's suggestions for improving the Israelite legal administrative systems. Essentially, he proposes a judicial hierarchy, with Moses dealing only with the problems of greatest complexity. Just shift for a moment to the beginning of the Parsha so we can see the psukim that she has summarized here. Yitro, hears about everything that God has done, takes Sipporah and her two sons, and they come together to Moshe to the wilderness. Yitro announces himself. Moshe goes out to greet him. They have a warm reunion. Moshe tells him about everything that's been happening. Yitro rejoices. Yitro then takes burnt offering and sacrifices. Aharon comes with the elders of Israel to Lechol Lechem, to share a meal together with Yitro, Lifnei HaElohim, in the presence of God. Moshe sits down to judge. Yitro observes this, has his comments, and again, we're going to see a lot of these things in greater detail, especially through the lens of Rashi and Midrashic comments on them. Sees what Moshe is doing with this extensive judging, says it's not good what you're doing, you're going to wear out, as will the people. This task is too heavy for you, you can't do it alone. And here's what I suggest, creating this system of leaders or judges of smaller sections. Let those people judge and settle the minor disputes, bring the bigger ones to you, and allow them then to share the burden with you. And then you will be able to bear up, and these people too will go home unwearied. And Moshe did as his father-in-law suggested, and designates these people, and then sends his father-in-law off, and Yitro returns to his land. And then chapter 19 begins with the introduction to the giving of the Torah, which then, or the giving of the Aseret HaDvarim, the revelation, which then occupies chapter 20. Although it is narrated before the Israelites' great encounter with God at Mount Sinai, this episode contains elements that lead the rabbinic sages to place it historically after Sinai. There is, for instance, the reference to Moshe's work as teaching the statutes of God and God's laws. These obviously could only have been administered after the law was given. Why then, if it happened after, is the Yitro episode narrated before Sinai? Okay, so this is a commonly asked question. If Yitro is giving Moshe instructions about how to efficiently and effectively and sustainably judge the people who are bringing questions that have to do with the Torah, which doesn't, in the chronological order of the chapters, hasn't yet been given, how can that make sense? So one approach is to say it isn't in order. The Torah was given already, and now Yitro is coming and giving this advice. And if that's the case, then why are things presented here in the Torah, not in the historical order in which they happened? The Midrashic reading opens up thematic analogies between the Yitro narrative and the giving of the Torah. It endows the very first word of the Parashah with profound resonance, Vayishma Yitro, and Yitro heard. And here says the Midrash, Yitro, priest of Midian, father-in-law of Moshe, heard all that God had done to Moshe and to Yisrael, his people, that God had taken Israel out of Egypt. That's the quote from the verse, and now the Midrash. What report did Yitro hear, right? We're told that Yitro heard, Vayishma Yitro, the Parsha begins. What report did Yitro hear that made him come and accept Israel's religion? Rabbi Yeshua said he heard of the war against Amalek. Rabbi Eliezer said he heard of the giving of the Torah and came. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said he heard of the splitting of the Red Sea and came. Midrash makes a radical assumption. Yitro's coming is no longer a simple family affair, but rather it represents a spiritual crisis in his life, a recognition of the power of God and a desire to unite his fate in some sense with that of the Israelites. Read in this way, the first part of the chapter culminates in an actual ritual of proselytization. We'll see how she spells that out a little bit more in a minute. Yitro proclaims, now I know that God is greater than all the gods. And then Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron and all the elders of Israel came to eat bread with Moshe's father-in-law in the presence of God. These are the sacrifices of the proselyte, of the one who commits himself to a full acceptance of the Torah. Indeed, they parallel the sacrifices that the Israelites bring in token of their commitment to the covenant. Okay, so in this paragraph, she's suggesting a reading of a couple of the psukim that basically incorporate what we call in contemporary halachic language about conversion, kabbalat ol mitzvot, accepting the yoke of the commandments. That's sort of his acceptance of God, essentially, and something which we don't have in the same form today in conversion, which is offering sacrifices. But we understand that in accepting the Torah as it's described, the covenantal ceremony that's described in next week's parasha, and Parashat Mishpatim, there are sacrifices brought. So we can understand that as a kind of part of conversion ritual, and we see Yitro doing that, and so she chooses, in light of the Midrash, to understand that as part of his conversion ceremony. In this Midrashic reading, the central question, therefore, is what did Yitro hear that made him commit himself to God and God's Torah? Right now, he's, as she said above, it's not just coming in the sense of showing up to visit or bring the family back together, but he's coming to join the Jewish people. So what would motivate such a radical move? The word vayishma, he heard, becomes vital. What one hears has power to move one to heroic transformations. This is a very Aviva Zornberg reading, sort of now kind of focus in on a word and say the what this word entails now is even more weighty and significant. In the hearing has moved him to do something. There's a certain power in the hearing, the transformative power in the hearing. However, the question that the rabbis ask and answer in three different ways is already plainly answered in the text. Yitro heard all that God had done to Moshe and Yisrael, his people, that God had taken Israel out of Egypt. The rabbi's discussion, therefore, seems redundant. Yitro heard the whole story of redemption and was inspired to join the people who experienced such wonders. In other words, when the rabbis ask, what did Yitro hear? The pasuk tells us what he heard. He heard the whole story. But the rabbis are, it seems, asking a more acute question. What was the specific narrative that had such power to move Yitro? Behind this compelling question lies a radical understanding of the power of narrative to address the privacies of individual experience. Now she's moved a little bit from just the hearing to what's being heard. Stories, right? A story, when you hear a story, some particular story, it has the power to transform you. The story that has generative power is more than a chronicle of events. It is a way of rendering a moment, a drama that seems to resonate with the listener's inner idiom. Registering such a narrative, Yitro is drawn to hear more. This kind of hearing, therefore, is not passive. According to Rashi, a report of one among the many miracles of the Exodus draws Yitro away from the substantial realities of his world into the desert. Now she's quoting Rashi's comment on a few psukim later. We'll just go to that pasuk for a moment, get the whole thing. So Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moshe's sons and wife to him to the wilderness where Moshe was encamped at the mountain of God, right? Potentially sounds a little superfluous. Just say the point is Yitro brought them to Moshe, where Moshe, who was camped at the mountain of God. What's the added dimension of to the wilderness? So Rashi comments, we also know that this happened in the desert. So what's being added here? But the text sings Yitro's praise, that he was settled in the honor of the world when his heart prompted him to go out to the wilderness, a place of emptiness, in order to hear words of Torah. Which is going to make a couple close textual readings of this midrash that Rashi's quoting. Yitro chooses desert nothingness over the honor of the world. His choice is, on the face of it, absurd. That is the thrust of the midrashic reading of the words into the desert. The high seriousness of Yitro's intent emerges from that absurdity. Only in the wilderness can he hear words of Torah. Only a place of nothingness can yield him his desire. Connecting this comment by Rashi based on the Mechilta with the opening of the Parashah, and I think this is a lovely point that she makes. Therefore, we decipher the core narrative of Yitro. He heard a story that moved him to leave all the honor of the world in order to hear words of Torah. Right? In other words, it's explicit in the first pasuk that he heard something, and and then he came. The Midrash has been asking, what specific thing did he hear that moved him to come? And the coming is more than just a coming. It's a coming in order to join oneself to the Jewish people. And then we have this other midrash that in the coming out to the wilderness to join the Jewish people, he comes in order to hear words of Torah. And so there's I'll let her say it. Hearing the story generates in him a desire to hear words of Torah. Clearly a different genre. Words of Torah are made accessible to him, desirable to him by means of a narrative. So we have this idea of a transformative hearing, which makes one willing to go from their comfortable place to another place in order to hear something more. Now she's going to get into the point that's going to sort of carry her forward through the next major section. Actually, maybe I'll pause here for a moment. Reactions to this kind of the interweaving of these couple of midrashim, and this idea of kind of what specific thing did he hear, and how does hearing a story transform one and move them to want to sort of hear something else or hear something new. Okay. Yeah, Lance, go for it. And then Bracha.
Okay. I disagree with this whole reading because number one, what does Moses do when Yitro comes? He runs out to greet him. Who else runs out to greet strangers?
Abraham.
Exactly. And who are those strangers?
We don't know.
They're angels. I don't think it's a question. And I think what you're seeing here is an ambiguity, a perceptual ambiguity. In other words, the wilderness, the midbar, is at the same time a desert and the magic kingdom. And in the story of Yitro, we have the story of, let's say, Joseph on his way to his brothers. An anonymous gentleman shows up. He's an Ish, but he's actually an angel who is, from my point of view, just an avatar of God, but however you want to look at it. So what we're looking at here is the sacred and the profane are simultaneously one. And the problem that the Hebrew nation has is, on the one hand, they can see God, and on the other hand, they can't. And this goes back and forth throughout Exodus. I think that, unfortunately, most of the readings that we have are one-sided and rigid perception and an inability to see a multiplicity of viewpoints. And I think that's, unfortunately, Professor Zornberg's problem here. I mean, there are other things that she does that I think are absolutely marvelous. For example, her video on Ruth, which I commend to you. The problem, one of the things I see here is you have Genesis and Exodus, and they are not two separate worlds, as it were, but they are very much related. And in Genesis, basically, you see God as a hierophany, as a manifestation in objects. And in Exodus, you see God as both. I mean, there's this, the clouds and the fire and all the magic kingdom stuff. And at the same time, you have here with Yitro, somebody who is just a man, a Kohen, let's put it that way to emphasize that. And I would urge you to look ahead, please forgive me, to the golden calf, where there are two stories. One is the omniscient narrator story, which is profane, and the other is Aharon's testimony, which Moses really doesn't particularly accept, and neither do most rabbis I've read. I think we've been over this before, but you have this dichotomy between the sacred and the profane, but it is a perception. It is a human perception. And that gets us into existential phenomenology, which I'm not going to go into at the moment, but there is a tremendous difference between classical perception and existential phenomenological perception. And that's what I'm talking about. And that's what you have to see here. That's what I see here. Let's put it that way.
Great. Great. Taking it in. Thank you. Bracha, go ahead.
Yeah, a very small but connective point that I noticed with, what's connecting Yitro and the people, the whole thing of Vayishma and Yitro's connection to the Torah and our connection to the Torah and the whole thing about that we're famous for having connected to the Torah through saying Na'aseh v'nishma, and the most famous Jewish prayer is Shema Yisrael. So it's like all these things seem to have a strong connective glue.
Beautiful, beautiful. The centrality of the idea of hearing and a Na'aseh v'nishma, as it's often understood, is sort of a almost a deferring the hearing. Right, here the hearing leads to action. In some sense, the Na'aseh v'nishma is almost a deferring of hearing and a prioritizing action. But more broadly, I think, the centrality of hearing is sort of.
So it seems like the quality of the hearing in each case is elevated. If they're willing to wait to hear, and if Yitro is hearing in a special way. So there seems to be a connection there as well.
Beautiful, beautiful. David L.
So first, I want to thank Lance for connecting the Magic Kingdom and the desert, because I've always thought of Florida as a cultural desert. I think it's great, or it's interesting at least, that Bnei Yisrael and Yitro are coming from different places. It's a group of slaves coming from their own place of nothingness, and he's coming from the seat of honor in the world. And the text is giving us both of those points on a spectrum of human experience, which is really cool. And the other thing that we see is Moshe, not motivated by hearing and motivated really by fear, has his own Yitro type of journey, leaving the palace, going out and becoming a shepherd in the desert, where he doesn't first hear, he sees. Now, I don't know what to do with any of that. And I'm hoping that Professor Zornberg is going to pick up on a couple of those points and lead us in those directions. Great.
Yeah, I think at least the Yitro direction of the journey. We'll see if we can glean anything on any other parts. It's excellent noticings. Here we go. We'll continue forward. Okay. The words "the honor of the world," kavodo shel olam, right? That's what the Midrash describes where Yitro was coming from in order to go out to the desert and hear words of Torah. The words "the honor of the world" bear a resonance that I would like to explore. If Yitro is presented in Rashi's version of the text as a hero of spiritual curiosity, inflamed by a story to leave all the glory of the world, then we seem to have a paradigm. This does come really to your point, David. We seem to have a paradigm for the situation of the whole people of Israel receiving the Torah in the wilderness. If such an analogy exists, indeed, it seems to be to the advantage of Yitro. Unlike the Israelites, he has everything to lose in this venture. What he has to lose is crystallized in Rashi's expression, the honor of the world. The word kavod, honor, suggests weight, kaved, a sense of position in the world, of substantial being. This he abandons in his desire to hear. And as we read on in Rashi's commentary, we discover a continuing use of the word kavod, honor, in relation to Yitro. This is something we've seen her do before, and I think it's just remarkable and requires a sort of close listening ear, not to look at Rashi or other commentaries as sort of, atomized, comments on one phrase or one verse at a time, but actually constructing something intentionally or unintentionally that we can pick up on the subtle themes in the text that they're picking up on through the cues of common words that they use in their commentary. A theme emerges that will raise questions about the inner world of one who approaches Sinai. In this extended narrative, the word kavod becomes a key to the paradoxes of the Sinai experience. Just going back for a second to say, she's already alluded to when she says a paradigm for the situation of the whole people of Israel receiving the Torah in the wilderness. That paradigm, which is the idea of coming from somewhere, leaving something in order to go to the place and receive the Torah. And this already now is I think the first point in what she's argued is this characteristic juxtaposition of narratives in different registers, the story of Yitro coming, and now the story of the Jewish people coming to receive the Torah. Then we're meant to hold them in tension or in some kind of relationship. And as she says, Yitro, somehow we see Yitro greater, not to the Israelites' fault or anything like that, but when we look at the two of them, they've come from being slaves to receiving the Torah. Yitro has come from being particularly free, empowered to receive Torah in some way. In rabbinic typology, Yitro is characterized as the petty, the naif, the seeker after truth, who is open to all forms of worship. When, for instance, he makes his declaration, "Now I know that God is greater than all the gods," Rashi comments, "This teaches that he was acquainted with all the idols in the world, for there was not one that he had not worshipped." Right? How else would he be able to say, "Now I know that God is greater than all the gods"? I guess this is there's different kinds of logic. Right? You could infer this, or you could argue it from experience. And Rashi's take is Yitro must have tried worshiping all the gods, and now he knows, or all the idols, and now he knows that God is greater than all of them. This kind of uncalculating openness, the readiness to worship, is expressed by the word petty, perhaps best translated gullible, seducible. In Rashi's text, Yitro's willingness to worship is conveyed in terms of his relationship to kavod. If, for instance, he's immediately described as father-in-law of Moses, Rashi comments on the first pasuk, Yitro chotein Moshe. Here, Yitro defined his honor as being in relation to Moses. "I am father-in-law of the king." Previously, Moses had seen his father-in-law as the source of prestige. As it is said, he returned to Yeter, his father-in-law. Yitro abandons all the honor of the world, a sense of a substantial identity, and now finds prestige in his relation to his son-in-law, Moses. In the next verse, indeed, he's described only as father-in-law of Moses, his personal honorific, priest of Midian, being dropped. And in verse 17 in chapter 18, even his name, Yitro, is omitted. His identity is now totally absorbed into his relation with Moshe. That in and of itself is interesting, and there are obviously other mentions along the way, so you have to kind of check them throughout the chapter. But she's arguing here for this process of Yitro losing the other dimensions of his identity to become exclusively identified via Moshe. The honor that Yitro has left behind has been replaced, therefore, by a new structure of identity. Remember, that was her title here when at the beginning. Yitro joins the Israelites, a new structure of identity. The vital importance of Yitro of such a structure emerges in Rashi's reading of his opening message to Moshe. See, again, we're just working through these Rashis because she is going to be developing this idea of the notion of kavod in Rashi, for Yitro in Rashi. "I, your father-in-law Yitro, am coming to you. If you don't come out to greet me for my own sake, come out for the sake of your wife, and if not for her, come for the sake of her two children." So the textual hook for this comment is that Yitro says, "Ani chotencha Yitro ba'elecha." "I, your father-in-law Yitro, is coming to you, am coming to you, with your wife and her two sons." Again, in the plainest sense, that's just a fully descriptive, comment about who's coming. But Rashi is sort of taking it as a, rhetorical or a series of arguments, right? You should come out and greet us because I'm coming. But if that's not meaningful to you, well, I'm coming with your wife. And if that's not compelling to you, well, I'm coming with her children. Yitro's plea here is for a demonstration of kavod, that the prestige in which he is held be staged by Moses. He asks for formal recognition. And indeed, Moses went out to greet his father-in-law. Great honor was done. This is, I believe this is Rashi too. Great honor was done to Yitro at that time. Since Moshe went out to greet him, Aaron too came out with Nadav and Avihu. And who could see these leaders come out to greet him without coming out too? This demonstration of honor for Yitro expresses a sensitivity to the situation of one who has abandoned his past, his social identity. The subtle indication in the text, however, is that Yitro actively lays claim to such validation. Rashi's commentary makes this quite clear and produces a complex portrait of a genuine spiritual enthusiast who hears an inspiring story that makes him abandon all the honor of the world, but who at the same time expresses a naive concern with his kavod, his social prestige, even in the place of nothingness. And this is, I think, a significant, these Rashis are significant because on the face of the text, I think there's very little that develops this idea or this concern, right? In other words, Yitro's coming, and, he's, as she says at the beginning, it looks like a regular family reunion. He's coming with, the rest of Moshe's family to meet Moshe. He identifies himself. Moshe goes out to greet him, etc. There's this whole subtle subtext of his concern with his kavod is not apparent. But once we have these midrashic developments of the intensity of what he's abandoning to come hear the Torah, the sense of him as this spiritual seeker who's sort of willing to go to a variety of places, and then this sort of emphasis on his honor, and the way she's rather intensively, but I think fairly, reading this Rashi of, if you don't come out to greet me for my own sake, she's sort of reading that as not just focused on Moshe, but focused on what Yitro wants. I want you to come out and greet me, and I mostly want you to do it for my own sake. But if not, then for these, the other relatives of yours. I think then all of that builds towards this interesting idea, as she says, well, this complex portrait, right? Somebody who's willing to let go of everything to follow something spiritual that they feel called to, but are still concerned with their own kavod and actively asking for it to be acknowledged. Rashi's text continues, and Moshe narrated. That's I think a very intentional translation, right? The Hebrew is vaisaper, which does mean to tell a story, but I think she's really zeroing in on that. Not just intensively translating it, but also drawing our attention to the fact that it's not just vayaged or vayomer, but it is this storytelling, this narration. That's what Yitro's seeking more of. Moshe narrated to his father-in-law everything that God had done in order to attract that's Yitro's heart, to bring him close to the Torah. The narrative that Moshe tells is one of suffering and salvation. Its aim is to attract his heart, to involve him emotionally in the Israelite adventure. The rhetoric of Moses' story subtly flatters Yitro, giving him a sense of his own importance. On the face of it, indeed, his reaction is naively wholehearted. Yitro rejoiced at all the goodness that God had done for Israel in saving them from the hand of Egypt. But here Rashi comments, Yitro rejoiced, vayichad, that is the plain reading. But the Midrash reads, his flesh became chidudin, pins and needles. Right? This Midrash is a play on the word vayichad. Plain translation, rejoiced, but chad means sharp. So vayichad, he became all sharp things, pins and needles. For he was pained by the destruction of Egypt. As in the popular saying, even to the 10th generation, do not denigrate the proselytes' people of origin. Okay, this is Rashi needs some unpacking. In this Midrashic comment, Rashi intimates the complexity of Yitro's situation. And this Rashi alone and her analysis of it, I think, is just very rich. On the one hand, he's drawn to the Israelite faith. He responds joyfully to the history of God's love for God's people. On the other hand, the weight of the past still hangs heavy upon him. His involuntary nervous reaction betrays his visceral loyalties. Against his conscious intent, which has led him to abandon those loyalties, his flesh expresses his involvement with that honor of the world, which had till now constituted his sense of specific gravity within it. Rashi may even be punning on the word meitzar, Mitzrayim. Yitro was pained, meitzar, by the destruction of Egypt, Mitzrayim. His pain is an Egyptian pain and arises out of Yitro's Egyptian past. Now, what does Egyptian past mean? So we go to the footnote where she quotes, there's a midrashic tradition that places Yitro in Egypt as one of Paro's advisors at the beginning of the persecution. Because otherwise, Yitro is a Kohen Midyan, so there's no obvious Egyptian association. But there is at least that midrashic one, which if we want to incorporate it into the story, helps everything hold together now. That when Yitro hears about everything that God had done, he both rejoices for the Israelites, but also feels this sense of empathy with the Egyptians, not just as fellow foreigners, but also as somehow a place of his origin or a place of his connection. In this portrait, and it really is a portrait pulling together these different Rashis. In this portrait, Yitro carries the imprint of past identity, even as he is drawn to strip himself of that kavod and engage with the nothingness of Sinai. The pressure of his history makes his skin prickle. Joy and pain coexist within him. It is out of a sensitivity to the position of the one who has sacrificed his past to the demands of a future dominated by Sinai that Moshe gives Yitro every compensatory sign of honor. In Rashi's narrative, Moshe personally waits on Yitro at the festive meal he eats with the Israelite leaders in the presence of God. The issue of honor is then close to the heart of Yitro's concerns. In Rashi's reading, even in his advice to Moshe about the necessity for a hierarchical system to deal with the people's legal questions, Yitro's concern is focused on the honor problem. This is Rashi on 18:14. Moshe was seated to judge the people, while the people stood from morning to evening. Moshe sat like a king while they all stood. This was hard for Yitro, that Moshe was taking the honor of the people lightly. So he rebuked him, as it is said, "Why are you alone seated while they are all standing?" Right? That's not just a preoccupation, with kind of why is Moshe dealing with this alone, but also, well, are you honoring the people appropriately? Rashi interprets the text to say that Yitro is perturbed at the offense to the kavod, the dignity of the people. In the Torah text, however, it seems at least as plausible to read his concern as being for Moshe, worn out by the overwhelming demands of the people. Before he makes his administrative proposals for a pyramid structure of small claims courts, he specifically warns Moshe, "You will wither up, as will this people who are with you." Nevertheless, Rashi, obeying a profound intuition about Yitro, places the sense of question of kavod at the center. Even the idiom for Moshe's exhaustion expresses the sense of weight. For the thing is too heavy for you, kaved. Rashi's comment is, its weight is too great for your strength. By insisting on the palpable experience of strength taxed by a burden, Rashi conveys Yitro's anxiety about overloading, about the possibility that a human identity, here she's going into her own sort of next register of meta thought, the possibility that a human identity may be fractured, disintegrated, eroded, right? That's an anxiety that Yitro has because he's moved from place to place. He was an Egyptian, he became a Midianite priest. Now he's following that which his soul and that which he's impacted by narrative motivates him to follow. But he sort of has this question of, who am I, right? That's sort of the new status or identity. Am I whole? Am I a kind of a complete or a holistic, person? What happens when you make these movements and go, even when drawn to hear something? Do you retain your kind of heavy gravity or gravitational center, something like that. His warning, and by the way, I will say, just as an aside, I think this pasuk that she quoted just a moment ago about you will wither up as will the people who are with you, it was like such a reminder to me, because so often I think this is quoted about, delegation, all like the leadership stuff, delegation, and that's the thrust of it. But that only focuses on navol tibol ata, right? You will wither up. But the pasuk actually is not just about Moshe's leadership, but what the impact will be on the people long term. The people will also wither, and it's clear that Yitro is concerned for Moshe's effectiveness and on behalf of the people. But I think she highlights that more here, the focus on the people and not just Moshe. His warning, you will wither up, 2, tells of erosion of the fibers of being, right? What will happen to Moshe? What will happen to his kavod, to the extent to which she's describing kavod as a sort of heavy groundedness or wholeness. His concern is obviously for Moshe's health, but his imagery remains preoccupied with the hazards of identity. Okay, so this is sort of her deeper reading at another level. What kind of person do you become, when you're not focused on kavod in the right kinds of ways? Yitro's advice, therefore, is to delegate the work of legal administration as a way of lightening his burden, which others will now bear with him. The ultimate effect of this reform will be, you will be able to stand, and all this people too will come to its place in peace. Just look at that pasuk for a moment. Right, the end of Yitro's advice, when let me advise you, get this extensive network of leaders. If you do this, and God so commands you, you will be able to bear up, which literally the Hebrew is stand. And this whole nation too, al makomo yavo v'shalom. Each translation here is, will go home unwearied. We could just say, will come to its place in peace. These expressions will resound with new power when we come to read of the people standing at Sinai, right? This idea, you will be able to stand, she's suggesting, is an anticipatory sense of, not just in general stand, but you'll be able to bear, to withstand the Sinai experience. Rachel, hang on one second, I'll just finish this paragraph. In paradigm form, Yitro is staging the essential problem of the Sinai experience. Can one hold one's standing ground there? Can one bear the burden without implosion? Can one's kavod, one's recognizable identity, remain intact in the encounter with the transcendent God who speaks from the wilderness? In abandoning the honor of the world, Yitro's urgent need is for the reaffirmation of the human measure. So now I think, again, she's set up for us a first answer to the question of, we go back up to the beginning for a minute. The characteristic juxtaposition of narratives from different registers of experience. So the first is the family reunion and the father-in-law's advice to the son-in-law. But it winds up being this paradigm. How does one, motivated by a call to hear, who comes to hear more, sacrifices something in order to go to the place of nothingness, which is where one needs to go to be able to hear the thing one is called to hear because of what one has already heard? How does one then ensure that they maintain some sense of self? And that's sort of the setup for the question, which she wants to ask a little bit more about what's happening at Sinai in general. Why do the people recoil? How is one to relate to such a retreat, which she's, I think, building towards with sort of the question of, you retreat if you're afraid that you can't stand your ground, and how does a people come to this place, to an encounter, and sort of stand their ground or not stand their ground? Bracha, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that it's talking about the people going to their place in peace. And Makom is also a name for Hashem. And that's probably the biggest challenge the people are having right now, is relating to Hashem. That's easy for Moshe, not so easy for the people yet.
It's great. Yeah. And even, right. Al Makomo Yavo V'Shalom. Is that the right language? Let's see. Yes, Al Makomo Yavo V'Shalom, which is also interesting. It's in singular, and it does evoke that the beginning of the very next chapter. Bayom Hazeh Ba'u Midbar Sinai, and soon after the Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar, and that shift to the singular, in the sense that they came unified as one in order to encounter God. It feels like they came peacefully, but exactly as you said, the particular language of Makom, which evokes that sense of God, will they be able to encounter God, in peace or not, is very much the question that she's sort of building up to, about the Sinai experience. All right, we're almost there. Yeah, Lance, go ahead, and then Dad. Haven't heard from Dad in a while.
Okay, it seems to me that Yitro coming to Moses and helping him with management is an exact parallel to Joseph coming to Pharaoh and helping him with management. The other thing is, from the point of view of a Karaite, everything that's been written here about Rashi and all the other rabbis is pure fantasy and absolutely meaningless. And anyone who doesn't accept this technically is not a Jew, right? No, you don't accept Talmud, the oral law, you ain't a Jew, even though your mother's Jewish. And the thing that fascinates me is that in Egypt, if you're a Karaite, Egypt today, if you're a Karaite, you're considered a Jew and you suffer from anti-Semitism. Okay, and it roils me. Obviously, I have a hobby thing on my back for this. But if you look at Joshua chapter 5, you will see when the Hebrews come and they celebrate Pesach, there is no Feast of Unleavened Bread, not mentioned at all, even though this takes place after the Book of Moses, supposedly. And when does Passover come out? The new moon or the full moon?
The full moon.
Okay, look at verse 1, chapter 19, the very beginning of Yitro. And what does it say?
It says, on the third month of the going out of Israel from Egypt, on that day they came to the Sinai wilderness.
Isn't there a new moon in there?
It's an interesting question. You're right. The translation has it as on the third new moon. The question is, Ba Chodesh HaShlishi. That is how it's rabbinically understood. I don't know if it's a necessary reading of the text or not, or if it just could mean in the third month.
But it's important because according to Professor Jacob Wright, the initial Shabbat was not a 7-day celebration. And there's a celebration here with Aaron and the family, but the initial celebration was the full moon once a month. And it seems to me that Pesach and Sukkot, am I correct, fall out on the new moon, and all the other holidays are somewhere else.
Pesach and Sukkot on the full moon.
Full moon, yeah, I'm sorry. Full moon. Right, yeah. And I think that's the way, let me put it this way. I was trained in the historical and comparative method, which breaks down to saying, ask the question, what was the meaning of these texts to the original audience? Now, there's no video, there's no audio, there are no commentaries. So it's virtually impossible to do this, but you can try, and I do. And it seems to me that what the rabbis are doing is absolutely totally not getting in touch with the original texts here. And I think I think the rabbis have a prejudice against me, the Kahanim, and I admit that. I love rabbis. I love you. I love you. I love the liturgy. I love everything. but I don't love the rabbinic prejudice against the Kohanim. And in 2009, and I'll end with this, in 2009, the rabbis of Israel destroyed the Ethiopian Kohanim, the Kesach.
Mhm.
They said, no more Kesach because you guys don't agree with rabbinic Judaism, okay? The Ethiopians took it, they swallowed it. No one seems to have questioned it. No one seems to be angry about it except me. I'm angry about it. And I thank you. I can't thank you enough, Rav Stephen, for allowing me to babble.
I appreciate everything you shared. And Dad, you're up next.
Okay, so to follow up on Lance mentioned about Joseph giving Pharaoh advice on management. So there's also in the Joseph story, his confrontation with Yehuda. And so that, to me, that story of Yehuda and Tamar comes at a point where it sets up Yehuda. He's not the viceroy of anything. He's the fourth son of Leah, though he might be the number one in Yaakov's eyes. But the story of Yehuda and Tamar, I believe, sets him up as a worthy opponent for Joseph. So when he comes to confront Joseph, even though Joseph is seated and Yehuda is standing, he is able to make his case to the viceroy of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you. Great. Okay, so some good textual parallels. And again, I wonder even, I don't know if the Yehuda story there is an example of juxtaposition of a story in a different register. I don't know, it feels maybe it's the same register as this Joseph story around it. I'm still curious to think about other things that might qualify as examples of what she's referring to there. Okay, we've got 2 pages left without much in the way of textual references in them. So we'll see if we can make our way through. The trauma of Sinai, the therapeutic narrative. Yitro's case is the more interesting in that, according to the Midrashic view, he has not personally experienced the revelation at Sinai. He comes, we remember, after the giving of the Torah. That is, the overwhelming scene of thunder and lightning and the endless crescendo of the ram's horn and the smoking mountain have been registered by him merely in the form of a narrative. But even in that form, it has had the power to draw him out of his kavod and into a place of nothingness. The power of words of imagination is both prodigious and unnerving. And Yitro's anxiety, revealed even in his pragmatic advice, hovers around a core awareness of the problem of kavod, of continued being in a recognizable self. In this midrashic perspective, therefore, the Sinai experience is communicated to the reader first through the medium of one who is not there, one who came after. By indirection, the reader has a first intimation of the potentially destructive or humiliating power of the moment of Sinai. To some extent, indeed, the revelation can be called a trauma. We shall consider this dimension of the Israelite experience at some length. That's again the rest of the chapter, worth reading. In Yitro's case, however, the transformation that threatens to undermine his familiar reality is mediated by words, right? Not by the lived experience, but by the words, by reports Yitro heard, and is made bearable to him, I suggest, by the therapeutic narrative told to him by Moshe. We have noticed Rashi's comment that Moshe's intention was to attract his heart, to bring him close to the Torah. One implication of this is that if Yitro is to be brought close, his emotional condition requires words of sweetness and meaning. His situation is volatile, with repulsion and attraction and tension with one another. Therefore, Moshe tells a salvation story, which addresses the most basic anxieties and desires of the listener. And Yitro rejoiced at all the goodness God had done for Israel. The therapeutic narrative, however, has larger and more penetrating power than this. We noticed Rashi's disconcerting double reading of Vayichad Yitro. He rejoiced, but also his flesh broke out in pins and needles. Moses' narrative engages on a visceral level with the ambivalence of Yitro, both drawn toward the Israelites and their God, and fearful of the impact of Sinai upon his selfhood. His body bears within it the imprint of his past. The pins and needles are the symptom of subconscious conflict. It is this conflict between the objective, hard-edged facts of his life, his case history, and the subjective yearning of his soul that the therapeutic narrative must address. The idea of such a narrative, indeed of a healing through story, is the subject of Rabbeinu Bachia's introduction to this parsha. Basing his discussion on the verse from Tehillim, the tongue's healing is the tree of life, Bachia defines the power of the tongue precisely as the power to heal the sick-souled. This psychotherapeutic power is more effective, he claims, than that of drugs or medicines, notably in that it not only removes the illness, but augments human life. It is the tree of life. Ultimately, the reference is to the language of the Torah. By the same token, language has an equivalent destructive potential to sicken the spirit. In Bachia's discussion, the sick soul is the soul that is far from God. The language of the healer can bring him to the spiritual wholeness that is closeness to God. In a classic midrash, Abraham wore at his throat a jewel pendant that had the power to heal the sick. This, writes Bachia, represents the healing virtue of language in Abraham's throat. His narratives brought people close to God. Moshe, likewise, told Yitro a story of God's power and goodness that moved him to adhere to the Israelite faith. This is the man, Bachia reminds us, who left the stabilities of civilization and went into the wilderness in order to enter under the wings of the Shekhinah, the presence of God. This passage, meaning this Rabbeinu Bachia, speaks of the power of language from a moral rather than a psychological perspective. The therapeutic narrative is, in fact, an evangelical narrative, unequivocally guiding by its rhetorical force the lost soul to God. This conflation of the therapeutic and the didactic, however, does not entirely confine the healing power of the tongue to the rhetorical. For even in Bachia's own discourse, there is an instructive ambiguity about the effect of Moshe's narrative. It causes Yitro to convert, but Yitro is described as the man who has already made all the necessary spiritual movements away from civilization and into the wilderness, as soon as he heard of the Exodus. Moshe's narrative works not to bring near one who was far, but to bring near one who has already come close. The virtue of the narrative, therefore, is that it engages with the ambivalences, the attraction and the repulsion of one who against all odds approaches Sinai. If therapeutic language is to give life, it must address a real trauma, a wound inflicted, in a sense, by the very encounter with God. So a lot there, and I don't even know what to say about it, but I think at least one or 2 points that I'm taking away from this last piece is first the last point about the idea that almost limiting our expectations of what these kind of power of speech, of therapeutic narrative can do. It can't necessarily get someone who doesn't want to come to come, but it can get someone who has come to, if we are hearing well what their ambivalences are, a story that can help them live with, integrate, overcome those ambivalences to get to the kind of final point of connection. Yeah, that's what I would say about the therapeutic narrative as this additional dimension. And again, I think we really need the rest of the chapter to try to get more into what was this traumatic experience at Sinai, and what was this sort of basic question about, can we retain our identity? But I think it's a good question to take with us into the Parashah as we hear it on Shabbat, sort of as we read it over the course of the week. What were the dangers in the Sinai encounter? What was the taking Viva Zornberg with us from earlier on, she has been asking the question, what was in the first half of the book, what was the identity formation that was necessary in order to leave Egypt? And whatever that was, now the question is, how does it continue to develop, and how can it be preserved in the face of the encounter with God? Great. Rav Scott, go ahead.
So what does she do with the end of the section with Yitro, when he leaves and goes back to his own land, then he's going back to Kvodo Shel Olam,
Right.
right? And he's going back to his old life, presumably. So how does that mesh with the rest of what she said? I mean,
Yeah.
Did he really convert? I guess
Right.
not.
Right. Yeah. I don't remember if she re-engages that over the course of the rest. I didn't read closely through. So that's an important question, which needs addressing. Because she builds up so powerfully this whole experience, and then it seems almost fleeting. So what do we make of that? It's a great question. Thank you. Lance, go ahead.
Didn't Moses destroy Yitro and his people at the end? God says, kill all your in-laws, and Moses says, no problem.
When are you referring to?
Pretty sure there's a command later on. I don't know whether it's in Numbers, Deuteronomy, but Moses is asked to go to war and destroy the Midianites, right? Am I wrong?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, there is a military attack against the Midianites. That's true.
Makes no sense.
Right. What does that mean for his relationship with Yitro? It's also a good question. Yeah, and then and there is an ongoing relationship over Nach with the Canaanites who might be Yitro's family. So it moves in and out, and I don't remember kind of more about how those relationships, where Yitro figures into that. So that's also something. Yeah. So they both. I feel like both of you in different ways are pointing to the continuation of the story of the relationship with Yitro, with Moshe and Yitro, with Yitro and God, Yitro and the Jewish people. Yeah. David?
It's for another time, but I think you have to read that war with Midian as coming after the sin of Baal Peor.
Yes.
And it never occurred to me before just now that Israelite men finding Midianite women attractive is something that happens to Moshe and then happens to the Bnei Yisrael. And I don't know what any of that's about, but it's really an interesting thought that thank you, Lance, for stimulating that. What I found really surprising tonight in this writing is that Dr. Zornberg skips over what I think is the most important word in the whole chapter, which is baneha, her children. And that if you actually shine the flashlight or the spotlight on that word, as opposed to Yitro coming to Moshe and saying, banecha, your children, it's I have to really marinate in Rav Aviva's words, because the way that I've always understood this story is as an effort at family therapy and family repair, more than Yitro coming on a spiritual journey. And just to focus a little bit more in the frontwards and backwards, it really does remind us of the story of Yaakov asking Yosef who these boys are, and the alienation of family that way. And it also, just to push a little bit further, it's the exchange between Rebbe Yochanan and his sister when Reish Lakish is dying, and she says, "Won't you take care of him for my children?" And he quotes a pasuk that says, basically, God's going to take care of them, but rather than God, he's putting himself in that position. The issue of leaders and their relationships with their families, in particular with their sons, is super complex. And I think that I read the chapter to be talking about that, and I look forward to absorbing the words of Dr. Zornberg, so I understand it from what did you call them? Multiple somethings of human experience.
Yes, somethings. Great. And I just, as you were saying it, I noticed that in her translation of that Rashi, where he says, Yitro, your father-in-law, I'm coming to you, with your wife and her two sons, right? He says, Ni chotencha Yitro ba'elecha v'ishtecha u'shnei baneha, your wife and her two sons. She quotes Rashi, if you don't come out to greet me for my own sake, come out for the sake of your wife, and if not for her, come for the sake of her two children, which is following through word by word from the Sukkim. But the Rashi here in Sefaria translates from the Mechilta, if you will not come out for your wife's sake, come out for the sake of your two sons, which is really, oh no, it's just the translation, because the Hebrew has it as Tsei V'gin Shnei Baneha. So wherever that English translation of that Rashi came from is inaccurate. Rashi and the Mechilta is faithful to the Psukim.
Yeah, Safari, it's a cover-up by Safaria.
Yeah, great. All right, thanks everybody. A lot to digest and great comments along the way. So thanks to all. Great night. Love to mom and dad and all. Good night.